Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jane Hewitt and I'm the Capability Building Coordinator at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand are part of the Info Exchange Group, a not-for-profit social enterprise that tackles the biggest social challenges through the smart and creative use of technology. And for those of you who haven't attended a webinar with us before, you can check out our training and education calendar on both of the websites for more details of events coming up online for the rest of the year. So welcome to today's webinar, an introduction to Microsoft Azure with Conan from the IT team. And before we begin, we'll just start with a bit of housekeeping today. All lines are muted, so if you have any technical questions or any questions at all during the webinar, type them into your questions box and I'll be able to help with any technical problems, and we'll have a Q&A coming up at the end of today's session where Conan will answer your questions. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a copy of the slides and the recording towards the end of today. And if you're on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the sound and the video. So please just close any programs that you're not using. And just before I start, I'd like to remind people that we do send out a really short survey at the end of the webinar, and we would really appreciate any feedback. So that's all from me. I will pass over to Conan to get things started today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jane. Yeah, welcome everyone. This is a very interesting topic, although I say that for all the webinars. But this is the first time that the IT team have done a webinar on Azure for TechSoup. Generally, some of you may have attended some of our other webinars, hopefully. And most of them circle around 365 and security. But Azure is obviously a very big deal. It's a big deal for us. It's been a big deal for a while, but it is increasing in, I guess, the frequency of conversations we're having with customers. Even though, in some ways, how often it's applicable is decreasing. And what I mean by that is 365 and Azure sometimes compete with each other. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, but first, to kick things off, we wanted to do a few polls, and this just helps us to understand the room, who's in here, what the content is, how to maybe adjust the content on the fly. I'll lean into certain things. So, yeah, we've got a few polls, so please feel free to click as fast as you can. Don't want to hurry up, but we'll try and move through them, and then we'll crack into the content. So do you want to start with the first one, Jane? Where are you on your Azure journey? Okay, so this is new territory for us, is the vast majority. There's a couple of people that are using it. Well, there's some that are using it. And then but others are still evaluating or are keen and just have not started. That's great. That's a good answer. This is really for those people in those top few categories in particular. Next one, Jane. You can just roll through them all as they come up. Do you currently have services in M365 or Office 365? Now, I have to distinguish this. Some people do have Office. They buy their software, either the packaged one or via online. And technically, yes, you do have Office 365, but that is a very light version of that. And so I'm assuming if you use Office, email, and SharePoint, OneDrive, etc., then you're using many M365 services. We're trying to use M365 and stop calling it Office 365 because that's what Microsoft wants us to do. Okay. And the largest group is using many M365 services, which is great. For those that are using just Office or none, it could be very useful to consider doing some Office 365 activity before you go to Azure, but maybe you've got a reason not to. So it's often the easier and a very productive first step. Next poll. Can not-for-profits get a get discounted or free services, poor wording there, in Azure. Okay, so interesting. We've got a bit of a mix. So the correct answer is the middle one, the slight majority. 5,000 not-for-profits can get $5,000 Australian, approximately, per year of Azure services, which is something we're going to talk about today. Not unlimited, that would be interesting, but there is 5,000. Azure doesn't, this is true and false, we've got a few true and false. Azure doesn't have any data centers in Australia or New Zealand. That is, yes, correct. I was about to say that's true, correct. False is correct. I mean, there are many data centers operating in Australia, in east, west, and there is one currently being built in New Zealand, due in about 2 or so years. So it's on its way. Azure is best used as an alternative to Microsoft/Office 365. That's right. Answer's correct, yes, false. Although sometimes they compete with each other as far as for what you want, and we get that from Microsoft as well. The people that are in charge of Azure don't really necessarily want you to lean into M365, but yes, that is correct. They are not opposing. And I think, is there one more, Jane, or is that all of them?
There's another one after this as well.
Oh, cool. Ooh. Azure is Microsoft's name for hosted virtual servers. True or false? There's a little bit of a trick question. It's not. That is a false. To be honest, though, I kind of wasn't sure what would happen with this one. To be fair, the hosted virtual servers are, running on Azure, but Azure is something a bit wider than that. But it's a little bit of a trick question because the hosted virtual servers are really the center of Azure for the majority of people. And next question. If we're on Azure, we won't have a need for an IT provider. True or false? False is correct. Look, it's a little bit of a trick question as well. This is really information by poll. You will have less, your IT provider will have less to do, to be fair, after the setup than an on-prem server, but unfortunately it's not really, unless you're pretty savvy and pretty enthusiastic, it's not really something that it's not as easy as something like SharePoint to administer. So that's that. Thank you very much for that, Jane. Now, As far as timing for this, the other day when I was reviewing this, I was a bit concerned that we didn't have enough content, so I beefed it up a bit. Now I'm concerned it's gone the other way and we've got too much, but we'll do what we can, yeah, we should be able to wrap around the end of the hour. So what we're going to cover today. What is Azure? I'm going to try best to go through this quickly. It's not actually a straight answer, to be fair, and Microsoft's descriptions are not the easiest to interpret as well. But we're going to talk about that. How can it help your organization? Will you still need a local server, or how does your local server fit into this? Critically, where I think the benefit of this webinar is around how we can show you how you as a not-for-profit could potentially use Azure, some applications and some examples. How much does it cost? Or how does the pricing work? And how do I gain access to the grant that I mentioned earlier on? Ongoing management of Microsoft Azure, how it works, and some build examples and case studies will be thrown in there as well. And there's a bunch of other things thrown in there too, but these are the core things that we've tried to cover based on that, which you may have seen if you've saw the description and the webinar invitation. Okay, so just a little bit about us. The IT team, if you've seen our webinars before, you might have seen this too many times. But we've been around for 10 years now, coming up 10 years in 8 days. That's cool. So we're a managed service provider, providing really, traditional IT support, but with a bit of a modern flavor. We do a lot of services around 365 and Azure. Not-for-profits are our major customer base, and we provide services to NZ and Australian. And if you go, I've just had some people say this, if you don't think we would support you, or maybe we seem a little bit too consulting oriented, usually it's not the case. So we sometimes are providing hardware, of course, to people as well as the key reason we interact with them. So yeah, feel free to reach out if you've got any questions. Okay, so Microsoft Azure. So Microsoft's description of Azure is, so this is the what is slide. Azure is a comprehensive set of services that enable you to quickly build, deploy, and manage applications across a global network of Microsoft managed data centers. Now, what does that actually mean? Microsoft, how they do these is they break. Sometimes it's very hard to actually, when you read the first description of their services, they've got something similar for 365, a collection of services that enable productivity. When you read that statement, it doesn't really tell you what it is. After you're using it, after a few years, you're like, yeah, well, yes, it is a set of services and it does enable productivity. But what would have been helpful when you're looking at it is if it said, a set of mail, file services, all those types of security services that 365 actually is, Office, etc. It would be good to have that description. And Microsoft, really, they boil everything down to applications. Now, what Azure is, we're going to go through in a couple more slides, but it is a comprehensive set of services. The most common one is virtual servers that allow you to quickly build, deploy, and access applications. A server also allows you to build, deploy, as in at your office, build, deploy, and manage and access applications too. The differences with Azure is it allows you to do it very quickly in any location and generally quite cheaply. It's flexible, open, and solid, as they say. So Azure is really, it's a multiple set of services that allow you through, I guess, a varied set of means to deploy your IT systems in a safe and, I guess, stable and economical data center. So trying to get a bit more clear on how this works we're going to need to explain SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS, as they call it, infrastructure as a service. So SaaS here is really, so what this is if you think about this, if you can see my mouse, this, I guess, encompassing sort of grid thing is effectively covering what is managed by the provider. So a SaaS provider, what do they manage? If someone here uses Xero is an example of SaaS, and they cover, so Xero, the company, they manage, Xero is an accounting system, they manage the data center that runs Xero, they manage the networking, they manage the servers, they manage the operating systems, because underneath Xero is still servers. They manage the tools and the database management and all the metrics and everything, and they manage the application. You don't do anything, you just access this application and then work on it. And Office 365 or Microsoft 365 is also a SaaS system. You pay a monthly fee, you access the tool. Yes, you do use applications like Office, but you access Exchange Online, and that's all. You don't have to manage it, you don't have to do anything. There is obviously some administration and some advanced functions, but generally it doesn't require you to do anything for it to work. Now, Azure is not SaaS. 365 is SaaS. Platform as a service. This goes a bit further, where all of these are managed by the platform provider, but the application is not. Now, an example of platform as a service is generally a web hosting provider. That's probably not a great example, but also in Azure, there's SQL, so a database as a service. So it won't do anything until you put the data in or add the database and access the database, but you are not required to do anything else along this list. So the data center, you don't touch that. You just manage, I guess, the data and the application. Now, infrastructure as a service, which is the central part of Azure, effectively the data center, the physical building, plant, everything, the networking, and the servers and the storage. And this is big because there's a lot to that. The actual hosted infrastructure and the storage underlying is managed by the infrastructure service provider. So they cover that, and then you need to manage this. So if you think about it, Azure, they take care of this half, and you need to take care of this. So the operating system, is it running Windows Server 2018? Is that Server 18 server booting up? Is it locked? Has it broken? You manage, you as in you, your IT provider, you're responsible for everything that side of the line. So they handle the servers, handle the infrastructure, handle the storage, handle the networking, everything from that point of view. But it doesn't mean it's going to operate until the operating system loaded, software's loaded, data's loaded, etc. So infrastructure as service is really what Azure is, although elements of Azure are also platform as a service. But this is what we're really focusing on. So why is, one thing I wanted to cover off earlier is, why is Azure a good service? Why should you consider it? Look, I wanted to say at the start, it is the future. So everyone is going to be, just like, let's say 8 years ago, I could have gone on a soapbox and said Microsoft 365 is the future. And a lot of people would have said, not for us. Well, I know that a lot of people on this webinar are not using it, but most people realize, some people use G Suite. Most people, if they've got an on-prem server, are intending to migrate to Microsoft 365 or use more of their services. The low cost, even if you're not a not-for-profit, if you're a commercial organization, the low cost, the low level of management, the minimal issues that occur with it, and the constant updates and improvement drive people to that technology. And generally, not many people are in 365 and are regretting their decision. I'd say it's very, very, very few. And so I would say, 365 is kind of 5 or 6 years ago, we would have said it's the future, and we would have been right. Azure is the future, if you need it. Not everyone here may need to use Azure, and I'll touch on that later on. But it is the future. So from a security point of view, it allows you to use some very sophisticated security technologies. It's different to 365 in that you can actually set up your Azure to be very insecure if you're not careful. But you do have the ability to set up some very impressive security things. And the things that are outside of your control are very secure. Scalability. This is one of the most powerful things in Azure, the reasons why you wish to use it. So you can do things like have your servers turn off at 8 p.m. at night, particularly if no one's going to be working, and then start up again at 5 a.m. in the morning. And it's going to save a lot of money. So you can do those types of things. You can have it reduce the resource. If you need to increase the resource, it's very easy to change that. So if you're a growing organization, it's not hard to go, okay, we've gone from this server to this server within a small amount of time because it's running a little bit slow, and you just pay the difference. Access worldwide, that includes choosing your servers and also accessing it. Hybrid capability, you can run certain services locally and in the cloud. And flexibility, it is a very flexible system. Similar to scalability, you can chop and change, you can use different tools, you can integrate with third-party services. It's very good. So there's a lot of benefits to Azure, and I'm not going to be spending a huge amount of time talking about the benefits, but these are the main ones. And if you've got any questions, then sing out. And obviously the price, but I'll come back to later. Footprint, 54 regions across the globe. The regions are generally cities. So they'll say, Australia East 1, which is probably Sydney, and Australia East 2 is Melbourne, and that kind of thing. But there's a lot in the United States. There's quite a few in Japan. There's many in Europe, and there's a good amount in the Asia Pacific region. Now, it is cheaper if you were to purchase a server from Texas, Dallas, or somewhere in the United States. So that's got a lot of space. You're generally going to pay less than if you are to store it in certain parts of Australia. That's just how it works. But it's not radically different. So, just discussing the core functions of Azure. So, these are really what Azure offers. So a traditional data center, you generally had the hardware and the virtualization, the operating system, right up into the applications, data, all in one stack. Azure splits it out. So you've got virtual machines, which is the most common usage of Azure at this stage. So that is really you're putting your servers into Azure. If you have a server in your office, if you have a server in another data center somewhere, if you've got multiple servers, if you've got a virtual host like Hyper-V or ESXi, you're running virtual machines. If you've got those can be migrated to Azure. If they're physical, they can be migrated to Azure. There's some things that you need to take into account, but generally any server can be in Azure. People often say things like, and to us, any customer that says they can't migrate their application to Azure is wrong. They just haven't understood what's possible. They're probably right, but it might be a price thing then, because the variety of possibilities is very good. Now, other services, really, when you get into that PaaS side, there is a lot of cloud services that you can access there as well, which is generally where you're not managing the operating system, they're not virtual machines, you're accessing technology. There's Internet of Things and obviously database services. Then you have websites, you can put your website in Azure, and mobile services, which is, if you want to host an app or something like that. But those are kind of the breakdown of the 4 sets of services in Azure, which is why it's not correct to just call virtual machines another name for what Microsoft's name is Azure. Now, I should say competitors to Azure, they probably wouldn't say your local, web company, your Melbourne IT or something like that are a competitor. They would say AWS, Amazon Web Services. They would say Google, the Google Data Center Services, whatever that's called. Not really anyone in New Zealand and Australia. Really, it's not big over here. I'm not talking about G Suite or the Gmail technologies. I'm talking about the data center. Generally, people either pick Azure, AWS, or Rackspace or another localized smaller provider. So those are the competition there. Right, so yeah, just I'm trying to not go too much into this and focus on what's going to be valuable, but if there's any further questions on kind of the makeup and what it is and how it works, then please let me know. So the most common uses across our customer base, these are the most common, I guess, functions, servers, or services that people are not-for-profits are using in Azure. So a lot of them, or a good chunk of them, are putting their domain controller in there. So on its own, there's a fair argument to say that you don't need to do that. You can just use 365, but it requires a change. Sometimes for security, you can't do that, but you can run your domain controller out of Azure. Now, usually you won't do it by itself, or usually you have a reason, but it's usually tied with one of these two, SQL Server as well, which should be on this list. File server, running their file server, usually alongside their domain controller, could be the same server, could be split, is operating in Azure. RDS, so that is remote desktop terminal server, you might have heard, often in conjunction with these. This has traditionally been a very common setup. People run these 2 or 3 servers together. And in Australia, if you've got a poor internet connection, there's a very good reason for that. You're not running services on your local machine, you're operating them out of a data center, and then you can run it anywhere. You don't have to, the bandwidth is not a huge issue. The application, it doesn't matter what you've got, you put the whole thing in Azure and you access it from anywhere. So this is a very common, has been traditionally a very common function. It's probably going out of fashion a little bit just because 365 is changing the way that people need to access, these services, and more applications are becoming web-based. But it's still very popular, particularly if you want to run in Azure, but you're spread across multiple locations. Azure Site Recovery, if you've got on-prem, if you've got servers, you can use this to back up your servers to Azure wholly, and potentially even recover to Azure if something goes wrong. It's a very cheap and effective tool. Azure Backup, this is data backup, so just backing up documents, files, etc. Application server, if you've got this is a very common one, some form of application, web-based or otherwise, it's very good to run in Azure. And a phone server, something like 3CX, running in Azure is very common. So these are the common, I guess, roles that people tend to have in Azure. The other one I should have in there is the database server, SQL server, which we cover a little bit later. So if you have a file server, domain controller in your office, and you're going, oh, can this go in Azure? Yes, it can. So how much does it cost? It's a broad answer, broad question, not a simple answer. I've got more characteristics of the system with relationship to cost here. So it's consumption based. So Azure's not like 365 where you pay $20 a user or $20 a license. You pay technically based on them minutes or hours, usually hours, and that's how they kind of express the consumption to you in the bills and the quotes. So you pay for what you use. You can calculate the hours into months, and they do that on the price sheets, but it is a consumption-based service. Now, you don't get a quote from Microsoft. You select what you want, and then they charge you for what you use. This does have some downsides. You can have predictable billing, and generally when we're working with our customers, we try and get the expected bills, but it's not fixed, and sometimes it does fluctuate. And we've had some challenges there, to be fair, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and I hope to get into that later. Reserved instances, you can lock in your servers for a set period of time to gain a reduction. So if you're paying month by month, that's great, but if you then decide, look, we're going to have this for 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, whatever, you can lock it in for 1 year or 3 years. That's the most common. And it will heavily reduce the cost of the service. Now, you can cancel the server and move that instance to another, the cost along if you're upgrading or changing, but fundamentally you will still have to pay that money that you lock in. Often missed is bandwidth and networking costs, which fluctuate. So if the first month you download a whole lot of data, or you uploading, it doesn't cost, but downloading does. If you're doing a lot of downloading for some reason, or a provider's doing something, the costs are going to rise, and that's why one of the reasons it's consumption based. So you need to try and factor that in, but you can only really estimate what the bandwidth consumption is going to be. And backups need to be factored in as well, and there's options for that. How much does it cost? It's generally cheaper than local data centers like Melbourne IT, or in New Zealand, Umbrella or VBridge or whatever else. There's a whole lot of them. This is generally it will be cheaper than those, no doubt about it, for pound for pound. But depending on the location, it might not be cheaper to do the migration. Now, yeah, it's often more economical, but not always, than if you were to buy the kit in your office, or wherever else you're going to put it. So yeah, it's not always cheaper, but it's generally a more economical total cost of ownership when you take into account all factors: backup, management, etc., licensing, etc. So hopefully that did answer that question or clear that up. I know it's a bit confusing. Why would I still need my local server? Well, there are a few reasons why you might go, hey, Azure isn't for me, or we still need a hybrid mode. So you can run a hybrid mode. You can have some servers in Azure, some servers locally, and that could be due to a delay, a transitionary period, a legacy system, or it could be due to just a situation with one of these other reasons. So some people were very comfortable with having a local server, and that's what they want. They just like it in the corner, and they feel like that is more secure, even though it isn't. Now, that's fine. We do have a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it's holding the asset. Sometimes it's lack of, I guess, confidence in an external party with your data. There are a lot of reasons, but that could be a reason to keep a local server. Internet performance, particularly in Australia, the network connectivity, the internet connectivity can be a serious issue. And that can change the makeup of what the solution in Azure would be, and therefore potentially drive the cost up and mean a local server is more applicable. But if you've got a very large local / centralized workforce, so you've got 60 people operating out of one office every day, and that's it, then it could be that you don't get the benefits of what Azure offers, which is around sort of benefits for distributed workforce, working from home, remote working, etc. And it could be that the performance benefit is best to keep it in your physical on-site. Significant storage requirements. This is another one. If you have 6 terabytes of data or 10 terabytes of data, it's probably going to be cheaper to run it locally. Maybe not, to be fair, but it depends on the performance. Often there's an application, similarly to the legacy systems. There's an application in your office. It could be that you run, we've got customers that run CNC machines, which is, the sort of actual machinery that needs to communicate with the server locally. It doesn't mean that Azure wouldn't work. It's just the bandwidth or the application has a certain requirement to be close to the server. So sometimes, and then there's sometimes other reasons, but the application, we say core application, most organizations have a core system or application, and the situation around that might require you to keep your local server. Designer and architectural firms, they often have design related content, large images, large design files, and it can change the makeup of the Azure plan. So usually these can be accommodated in Azure. It's just the price can go a bit higher than it would if you had it locally. Legacy systems, you might have a really old piece of software and it's too hard to move. Licensing costs, if you've already bought the license, it might not be worth transitioning to Azure and rebuying the license. And then some people have a preference for capital expenditure. They want to pay 50 grand once every 3 years rather than $1,000 once a month. So those are a set of reasons why you might want a local server. Ask questions if you want to know other ones. Ongoing management. So this was something I touched on at the beginning. Does Azure require ongoing management? It does. It's not that easy. It's not like there's an argument. There are organizations that once they get fully into 365, they've got a key person internally that administers SharePoint. I believe there's benefits, of course, to having an IT person, particularly with things like security and guidance. But technically, people can administer and run that without an IT pro or an IT company. Azure, it's pretty hard. It's not the most intuitive system to manage. So IT companies like us are kind of still needed, unfortunately, to keep these things running. There's no physical maintenance, which is great. So you don't need to have any, the equipment in the office doesn't need to be maintained. And often issues we have when we're running, IT, when you have IT issues, often they're related to the physical equipment, which you don't need to do. So, so that's a benefit. There's a reduction in the management. But as I've said on the next point, servers and services require some level of monitoring and maintenance and support. Backups need to be monitored and tested periodically. Your admin and finance team do need to monitor the costs. Now, that could be done by the IT person, but more and more you can get your admin and finance team to keep an eye on that. And the other thing is it's good to be aware when new opportunities arise. You put a server in, in 3 years' time or 2 years' time, it may be that something else is available in Azure that's going to allow you to do it better and cheaper. Now, some additional considerations before we get into some of the nitty-gritty around options and examples. So you do need to consider backups. It's very easy to look at the server and do the calculation and forget that you do need to back it up. The Azure system, they kind of handle the infrastructure, but they don't back up your data by default. You have to enable backups and the schedule and how many backups you want. So you need to consider that. And there's multiple ways you can do backups. You can do image-based backup, which is a pretty good backup, I guess. It allows you to roll back, snapshot-based backups, they call it sometimes. Or you could just do the data. You really do want to do both. Bandwidth costs, as I said earlier, you need to take into account bandwidth costs and networking costs. Fluctuations can be painful. We've had some issues. We had a customer where we provisioned a database and automatically migrated it, and then at the end of the month, because we weren't keeping our eyes on the price, the cost of expected cost of $200 was $5,000. We were spitting. This was our fault. We took responsibility for it, paid for it, and everything like that. But there can be some dangers if you don't necessarily do it right, and even we didn't do it right. It can cause some financial impact. Whereas the good old days with a data center provider locally, you'd ask them for a quote, they'd say this is what it's going to cost, and that's usually what you got billed. So there are some upsides and downsides to this. It is evolving technology, and that is a good thing. They're constantly, Microsoft is releasing an updated new, let's call it a new offering, which could be an evolution of an existing offering, but a new offering almost weekly. We get an announcement, oh, this has been added, this has been changed. Some of them are really new and quite exciting. Last week, Microsoft announced 365 Desktop, I think it's called, which isn't Azure, but it's a new and exciting way that people can sort of run their desktops. And that's something that's great about using Microsoft technologies. There are some negatives, but one of the great things is you get the benefits of their updates and new technology without having to invest anything apart from obviously the money to use the service. Licenses are required. So when I say this, you do need to factor in the Microsoft license or the SQL license. It will be part of the build plan that you can do in the pricing calculator, but it's easy to exclude the license and then later assume you're going to add it or that you already have it, but realize that you need to buy it through Azure. Sometimes you can use your existing licenses, but you do require software insurance. And so it's often good to assume that you can't. Reserved instances, as we said, when you're doing your predictions, locking in the reserved instances can save a lot of money. And critically, you can put in place consumption restrictions. We've had we've had situations where we've gone, okay, we're going to budget for $400 a month or $500 a month to meet the grant, and it'll basically slow down the server if for some reason there's other consumption to keep it within that price range. But there's obviously potentially an impact for that. So yeah, now virtual machine. This is what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or 10 minutes are the virtual machines and the virtual machine options. So this is what Azure is all about. It's a server. You're putting your server into the cloud. So we are going to show, I'm going to show some examples, but critically, these preset plans. You don't say I want one CPU and 29 gigs of RAM. You go, that plan correlates closest to what I want, and if you need to increase the resource, you go to the next plan. And it's things like 2 CPU, 8 gig of RAM. And then if you want to go higher, you get 3 CPU and 12 gig of RAM. There's hundreds of plans, very high performance ones. We've got some customers doing some really fancy things around graphic design, architecture, and they have these really impressive RDS servers that allow you to run it as though you've got a high performing local graphic enhanced device. So those options are there. You can choose from many locations around the globe, as we said, where you want to host it. And as I've said before, infrastructure as a service is what this is, but it still requires the operating system to be managed. So an example, and I should have changed the orientation of this. We're going to go into the Azure, as I said at the beginning, you can get up to $5,000 Australian. It's around about that. It fluctuates a bit a year. It's $3,500 US. So if you take that out, that's something like $450. I think it's 460 New Zealand a month. So these are New Zealand dollars because it was easiest for me. Let's assume the Azure Grant gives you $460 a month, $450 a month, something like that. So this is an example of the table. This is the most simple. We run a service called 3CX for our customers. It's a really good phone system, and it's really basic, and you need a server. And the best place to put it is in Azure. And if you're running the server 3CX Basic, 1 to 20 extensions, that'd be a standard site. You need a B1S plan, which is 1 CPU and 1 gig of RAM. It doesn't require a Microsoft license. It's pretty basic. We factor in a hard drive, IP address, and some backup. $31 a month. So that's quite cheap, to have that. 3 years, $22. Not a huge saving, but it's not too bad. So this is an example that could go on your grant. If you had a phone server, and if you want to talk 3CX, feel free to hit me up, but that's a pretty low cost server. So you don't really get that type of low cost server many places, the ability to have a server at $22 a month. So that is why Azure is quite cool. So getting a bit more interesting, a bit more applicable to people on this call. If you've got a simple domain controller, so as in you're not really hosting a lot of files on site, maybe a few, but not much, and you're really running authentication. Now, not many people will be running just a domain controller, but you obviously need it for security. And if you've got a server in the office, its main function may be being a domain controller. I have to say there's other ways you can do this, but this just gives you an idea. A very basic domain controller, a B2S plan, which is 2 CPU and 4 gig of RAM, some SSD hard disk, we go for high powered, traffic backup, etc. $87 a month with a 3-year reserved instance is $51. So pretty cheap. Now you could run a little bit of documents on here and maybe some sort of integration with an application provider that you use, but $51 a month. This is where we're getting to the more practical side. I know I just said that. This is a domain controller plus a file server. So if you've got a file server in your office, you don't feel you're ready to move to SharePoint, or you don't want to in 365, but you want to move that file server domain controller to the cloud, this is likely what it's going to cost you. So we've got a B2 MS plan. Now I need to say, we've merged the domain controller and the file server into one server. A lot of people don't want you to do that, but there's a lot out there about splitting those. But for small businesses, small organizations, they tend to go with this as a structure. They've got a single server in their office. So backup traffic, there's more backup there. You're looking at $259 per month on pay-as-you-go, $260, or $186 on 3 year. So let's say you've got your Azure grant. Well, you're well and truly covering that with that grant. Now here's where we're getting even more heavy. Okay, this here is a domain controller and file server, beefed up the resource, and an RDS server with licensing. So you've got to calculate the number of users here, which may not be helpful, but let's say you've got 10 users, you're going to have to bump that up to $80. But this is a full RDS server, so a terminal server, if you're another name for it. And it's very good. It's probably very common in Australia. We do hear about it regularly. Very good if you got people of varied locations. You've got a key application, or BYD situations where people need to use they need to access the company systems, but they might be using their own device. You could run this now. It's the most expensive of what you've seen so far. But as you can see, $250 pay as you go, 3 years down to $100, less than half. So overall, you can go $600 on pay as you go, which is going to be higher than the grant, but it is two pretty good servers. But on 3 years, it is $380, which is lower than the grant. So in particular, you add $80, you're pumping up, you're bang on there for the grant. But what you're getting is, if you purchase this server running locally with backups, you're paying a lot of money to get this operating well. So it's going to be a really good money saver here. SQL, so I'm not including the DC in the file server, but if you had a SQL box, SQL requirement, you're going to need something very, very grunty. So we've got some really good SSDs here. We've got 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM. Not all these plans, it's not just about the resource, the speed, there's power, there's the performance of the resource, the quality of the resource. So this is a SQL recommended service, so it's quite powerful. You're looking at $380 excluding the license, which does depend on what you're using it for, down to $300 on a 3-year plan. So most of the disk doesn't change, it's really the resource. So SQL licenses can be expensive depending on what you use, but this just gives you an idea of what you might pay. So obviously these would probably, depending on the license, come underneath the grant limit, but yeah, this is a good example of what several of you might have. Right, so Azure Site Recovery, this is something else that you might want to use it for. Let's say you want to keep your servers on site, but you'd like to use your grant. You can run Azure Site Recovery, which is effectively, it is a backup, but it's more of a business continuity system. So it allows you to flick a switch and then your servers will recover into Azure as they were last backed up. So it's not the type of thing you want to go back 3 weeks to grab a file. It's a recovery tool, but pretty cheap. You're looking at around $50 per server, depending on the storage. So if you've got 3 servers in your office, you're not ready to go to Azure, but you want to add another layer of backup, you can add Azure Site Recovery, attach it to Azure. If something goes wrong, you can then recover those servers in Azure fairly quickly, and you're only paying $150 a month, and it's coming out of your Azure Grant. Azure Backup, this is more for data backup or image-based backup, potentially if the servers are in Azure. But Azure Backup, you can back up, a terabyte for something like $1 a month. It's just very cheap, maybe $10. I don't know. It's some division of 10 or 100, but it's very cheap for backing up your data. Let's say it's $10. It's probably not $1. So $10 to back up a terabyte is probably the amount you're going to have, and that's going to have really good retention policy. So if you want to back up a lot of data that you have at your local machine, local server, then you could use Azure Backup. Now, the pricing calculator, before we get into some examples, this here is a very good tool for, this is how you can price it up. I was going to show it, but I don't think I need to. It's going to allow you to produce what I just showed you. So you select your virtual machines, you select your storage, you select your licenses, you select your location, and it'll give you a price in the dollars that you require. And then you can select reserved instances, etc. And there's some examples, etc. So, case study, customer A, call them. They've got a physical server. They've got 3 physical servers, a domain controller, a file server, an application server. For argument's sake, this is 1 physical server with 3 virtual servers, but let's just go with it. They've got a domain controller, they've got a file server, they've got an application server. The application needs to be running on a server. It can't be web-based just yet. The customer's not ready to move to SharePoint. They're just not keen on it. They prefer the file server function. And so they're considering replacing their servers at the moment, spending 20 grand on the hardware, or going to Azure as an option. So what's it going to look like when they're moved? Well, this is their site. They're going to continue to use 365 services. They're using SharePoint, they're using OneDrive, they're using they're using a little bit of SharePoint, they're using Exchange, Office, etc. But their servers are in Azure, different to here. They are connected. Azure and 365 are connected, but they have 2 servers running in Azure. Now that should have a connection there, but I didn't want to create a big stupid line. So the mobile devices are able to connect to Azure as well as 365. And then the backups are off to the side. And we tend to put the backups in a different location. So if we've got the servers in Sydney, we put the backups in West Australia or Hong Kong or Japan or something like that, if we're comfortable. So this, if you're looking at a network diagram, technically this is what it looks like. There are still servers, they're running Windows, they have a background, they have a start menu, they have a time, they can go down, but they're running in Azure. Now, an example of what this organization is going to pay for the file server, pretty low, as you can see, B2S plan. The other server, the application server is a bit more grunty, and we've got some good disks here. And we have some 8 gig of RAM and 2 CPU. Now, depending on the application, you may need a fair amount more than that. but you're looking at $277 a month, or a 3-year instance, $204. Now, I haven't included SQL. We don't know if the application requires SQL. If it does, there will be more cost, but you'd attach it to the server potentially. And I haven't separated the domain controller and the file server functions in this instant. Yeah, and if you're having 3 servers, you'd probably increase that by 30%, and you've got the same amount, maybe a little bit more. So this is an example of what that customer, they're going from this 3 servers and to go to this, excluding 365 costs, their 3 servers are going to probably cost them 20 grand to purchase the equipment. Go to that, 204 bucks a month, get it on a grant, don't pay anything. So the Azure Grant, what is it? How does it work? You get $3,500 US a year. It requires a credit card to be loaded, so that should be your credit card rather than your IT provider's credit card. Once the $3,500 is consumed, you'll get charges to your credit card. So you need to keep an eye on it. What do you have to do? You need to register a TechSoup, which I'd assume everyone here has done. You need a Microsoft tenancy, which, with a not-for-profit approved account, which if you haven't, go to nonprofit.microsoft.com. Now, I'm actually assuming most of you will have already done this. So if you have 365 licenses, like E1 licenses for free, you're past this point. So you can apply for Azure credits within the nonprofit.microsoft. I think it doesn't have a -.com, or maybe it does have a hyphen, excuse me. And your application for Azure credits, you fill that in, and generally you get approved within a couple of days. Around COVID, it was taking weeks, but generally it's approved pretty quickly. That is what it looks like. The Azure Grant is in here. Once you log in and your status is approved, you click on this Azure Grant and you get some questions that you have to fill in, and then you get approved. And you'll start to see this. You have been approved, start date, when the credits expire. So you get a year to use it, and then it just does roll over to the next year. You may need to reapply or something, but I wasn't sure. In discussion with someone, some of my team thought you did and some of them thought you didn't. So don't take that as precise information. But generally, it's at least if you do have to apply, it's an easy grant for the second year, and you don't necessarily need to have a look at that. So some resources. The Azure for Not-for-Profits page is here. You'll get this if you grab the slides. You'll have this information. Pricing calculator that I showed before. It's very cool. I might just pull that up for a second if you can. Can you see that screen? Yes. So this is what the pricing calculator looks like. It's not the easiest to use, but it's pretty good. So as you can see, there's the 3sec server that I had earlier. You can select the machine. So Australia East, Australia Central, Australia Southeast, Central 2. I'm not sure what the difference is between those, but they are obviously probably different locations. You select the operating system. So Windows is obviously a bit different. You just do OS only. This is just the tier. It's as far as you can have a low performance and low support, but we do standard. And then these are all the options. Literally, there are, I said hundreds. That's probably an understatement. Obviously, you can see it's calculated based on how A1, very low cost. You're talking about some pretty basic costs there. Overall, the Windows license is probably making up 90% of the cost, right down to some of these ones which are pretty pricey. So that one there, yeah, as you can see, 5,700 gigs of RAM. That'll be doing something pretty special, probably running Netflix or something like that. And yeah, they pay a little bit for it. But if it's Netflix, they probably earn it. So yeah, so there's lots of options here. These NV ones are the video ones. They're still pretty reasonable, but they're very powerful. And then you add your disks, add your storage transactions, which is an estimate. It gives you an indicative one. Add your bandwidth estimate, and then go on to the next one. So that's how that works. And obviously, as you can see, there's a lot of different things in here. AI, machine learning. I don't understand this. I don't know how to use this stuff practically just yet. Some of our team play around with it, but someone could spend a year in here and they'd still have a lot to learn. But that's why I said at the beginning, it's not just virtual machines. There's a lot to it. Right, I'm just going to go back to the. So have a look at the pricing calculator, and obviously TechSoup has a page on Microsoft Azure credits and how to access it, which is going to give you even more information. You do need to log into TechSoup to access that link. Now, question time. I know that was a lot of information meandering through Azure, and some of you might feel you need a bit of information on why, but I think this is around, going back to the beginning. If you have servers on site and you want potentially another option rather than replacing them, this is where you go. Anyway, questions?
Thank you, Colin. That's a lot of information. Yeah, we have a couple of questions. One from Joy. In the situation where costs have risen per month, what controls facilities do you have to be able to identify which user application usage is causing the increase in usage?
Good question. That's a difficult one. So generally, what Azure has, they have some very good tools around what your predicted bills are going to be. So you can go in and on the 12th of the month, and it will say, well, this is you're going to end up paying $700 this month or $400 this month. And you might ask, why doesn't everyone just lock in a fixed amount? This is a good question, but it does potentially drop the resource of the server, and if something goes wrong, it could potentially shut down the server. So that's why you don't want to do that. So you'll be able to see in Azure what servers or services are consuming or changing the cost. Usually it's because you haven't set up something right, or there's a huge amount of data transactions, or someone has changed something. Like say, if you've got your IT guy, they've lifted the resource. That's why. It doesn't just happen by accident. When I said earlier we got surprised, that was usually because we set something up. We were trying to be too smart. We set something up that we probably shouldn't have. But you are very unlikely to go from $300 one month to $900 the next. It's more like going to be $300 to $340. But the challenge is you'll be able to determine the machine. You'll be able to determine the function within the machine, that is, as in the resource within the machine that is going to be, I guess, consuming more or under pressure. But you're going to have to access the server to understand why. But the thing is, Azure doesn't, unless you set it up, Azure doesn't sort of increase the server spec because it's running slow. That's not something it does. The server's just going to run slow. So I may have overstated or unintentionally overstated the variable possibility. It doesn't happen by accident. It's usually if you've set something up. Bandwidth and increases, manual increases, are the reasons why costs go up.
Cool, thank you.
Increase, yeah.
And one question from Peter. We've been informed by our IT providers that you can't apply the credit to a reserve instance. Can you confirm that or otherwise?
Look, I might come back to you on that one, Peter, because I recall, my memory is a bit shoddy, but what's possible is we had that same thought too, and it may have changed, or we've realized that you could do it, or I'm wrong. So I'll come back to you. I'll flick that out to you, Jane, to pass on, because either it's changed, it may have changed, because I've currently got the perspective that you can, but I could be wrong about that, Peter. There have been traditionally some limitations with the Azure Grants, but I can't speak right now if it is that. They could be correct, Peter. I'll come back to you.
Cool, thank you. Peter, if you could just type into the questions box your email address so that we can get in touch with you about that. That would be cool. Brilliant. I think that's it for questions.
Brilliant.
We're almost out of time. But thank you, Colin. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you've learned a lot from that. If anybody thinks of any questions in the next day or so, do get in touch with us or drop Colin an email. Their email address is just up there at the moment, webinar@theittteam.co.nz, and they'll be happy to help. And keep an eye out for your email in your inbox, and I'll be sending along a copy of the slides and this recording towards the end of today. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you very much, Colin. And if
Thanks a lot.
everybody could please fill in the short survey with any feedback, good or bad, we'd really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day,
Cheers.
everybody.
Take
Cheers.
care.
Bye-bye.